From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. In July, Bolivia passed a new child labor law that attracted a great deal of international attention. The South American country made it legal for children who are at least 10 years old to go to work. This goes against a United Nations convention which, for the most part, sets 14 as the minimum age at which one can start to work. Supporters of the legislation say that some children in Bolivia are already in the workforce before they turn 14 as part of the country's informal economy, and recognizing their status as workers allows them more legal rights than they had before. But critics of the law say the first priority for children should be education and safety and not employment, and that the law should be repealed. Today on Global Journalist, we will look at the law in Bolivia, what effects it has had thus far, and discuss the state of child labor worldwide. I'm joined from La Paz, Bolivia by Sarah Shariari, a freelance journalist who has covered the new law. From Geneva, Switzerland by Simon Stain, who is a manager at the International Labor Organization specializing in child labor policy. And from La Honda, California by Sarah Bachman, the co-founder of photoforchange.org, which carried out a photojournalism project looking at child labor around the world. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us on Global Journalist today. Sarah Shariari, I'd like to start with you. Can you give us a little bit of background about the law? How did it come to be proposed in Bolivia to lower the minimum age at which one could start to work?
Well, for a couple of years now, the government has been working on a new version of a law that touches on many aspects of children's lives and rights. And it looked like, in terms of minimum age last year, that the law would go forward maintaining 14 as across the board the minimum age for labor. And then organizations of working children became involved in the debate. They met with senators, they met with the president, and they wanted the age lowered so that their work is protected under law, so that they have legal recourse if they're not paid or they're otherwise abused by an employer while they're doing their work. So they proposed that the minimum age be lowered, and after much debate and meetings in July, the new law was put into effect, and it now allows children as young as 10 with special permission from government entities and their families to work independently, and children as young as 12 with the same special permissions to work for an employer.
Now, Sarah Shariari, did you see in your coverage there, was there much opposition to this proposal? Were there people who were saying, this is not a good idea in Bolivia?
There definitely are people in Bolivia and internationally who say this isn't a good idea. There are people who point to the Minimum Age Convention, which Bolivia is party to with the International Labor Organization. There are people who say it's a step backwards for children's rights, that more children are now going to enter the labor market and that they'll be more vulnerable. But there wasn't a highly organized resistance to it. It was more individual voices and international organizations speaking on it.
Now, you mentioned the ILO convention about child labor, and I'd like to read from a report that the ILO issued on the 28th of July that says, quote, it was in response to the labor law in Bolivia, and it says, quote, the ILO notes that certain declarations made within the framework of the adoption of the new code could imply that child labor is an inevitable reality. Numerous studies and analyses show the intergenerational cycle of poverty and child labor. Child labor prevents children from acquiring the education and skills they need to access decent work as adults and allow them in the future to put their children in school. Child labor cannot be justified as a necessary evil and a means to development. Governments are obliged to protect children and adolescents from child labor by, among other measures, establishing social protection floors to protect them from poverty. And Simon Stain, I'd like to turn to you. Why do you think that Bolivia, which is a party to this convention, would want to move away from it?
Well, I think you probably need to discuss that with the body politic in Bolivia. There has been a discussion in Bolivia about the nature of treaty obligations that were entered into before the advent of what is called the plurinational state, and a discussion about whether those treaty obligations should be considered binding. But in international treaty law, they clearly are. What's interesting about the particular case in Bolivia is that the rest of the region, every other country, is moving in the opposite direction, seeking to strengthen child labour laws, increase the protection for children. Brasilia hosted just last year the 3rd Global Conference on Child Labour. Argentina will host the 4th Global Conference in 2017. There's a hemispheric agreement on the elimination of child labour between the member states in the region. So it's interesting that Bolivia has taken this very unusual step to reduce the minimum age below what it was before, and below the minimum age that is permitted in the convention which it freely ratified in 1997. You just mentioned our statement, and that is really at the heart of it. Protection against child labour is a protection of children's human rights. And if we start saying, well, because the children protested and wanted to reduce the minimum age, we could make that argument about a lot of other things that children want to do that we as adults don't let them do. On a banal level, we could say we don't let our children eat what they want. We don't let them run in front of trucks, and we make them brush their teeth before they go to bed. Because as responsible adults in society, we make the laws to protect children, and we listen to what they have to say. That's absolutely right. They have a right to be heard, but we don't necessarily do everything we don't let them do everything they say they want to do. And the protections against child labour are fundamental to individual children's well-being and to the development of society, and as we said in our statement, to breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. If you start picking at this human right, well, which other ones do you want to pick at? Freedom of expression, discrimination? These are problematic positions to take, I think.
Simon, what would you say to the supporters of the law that would argue, perhaps, that because these children are already involved in the economy and in the workforce, that they should have some level of protection, even though the situation they're in is not the one that's most ideal?
The government has an obligation to protect children against risk and hazard and against child labour. The answer to a violation of a child's human rights is not how to somehow make it still a violation, but sort of quite a bit less egregious. The answer is to deal with the human rights violation, and the exaction of child labour from a child is a violation of their human rights. Now, clearly, children are involved in the labour market in types of work that are not acceptable child labour all over the world, north and south. And there are other types of work that children do that are perfectly lawful and should be absolutely protected, and their working rights to enable them to have decent youth employment. But the minimum age at which we let this happen matters. And the minimum age that would be acceptable for Bolivia to have for light work, which doesn't interfere with education, could be 12. And the minimum age for general work, 14. But 10 is simply too young, and it goes outside Bolivia's obligations.
Sarah Bachman, you and your group have traveled across the world to document the state of child labor, with your photojournalism project, photoforchange.org. Can you tell me a little bit about what you and your group have seen in terms of the conditions in which some of these children are working?
Sure. Thank you for asking me to be on your program. Just 2 points of clarification. The founder of Child Labor in the Global Village, which became Photo for Change, is a photographer, Julia Dean. She's based in Los Angeles. I'm co-director.
Okay.
I started writing about child labor in 1995, mid-1990s, when I went to Bangladesh. And at the time, there was an attempt in the United States to ban the import of goods made by children. Bangladesh felt this very hard because there were children in garment factories. And there were a lot of children, who said to me at that time, okay, you can tell us not to work, but then what will we do? Because we have to work to support our families and to support ourselves. So I've heard that argument many times over. In Bangladesh had a groundbreaking and historic agreement between the garment factories and other entities, which has been has had a lot of influence over time. But there are still many instances when you talk to a child and the child will say, you can tell me not to work, but what else am I going to do? So to give you an example of children that child labor in the global village photographer, a child labor in the global village photographer photographed and wrote about, there were children in a garbage dump. That's awful work. That is, by definition, by the ILO's definition, which, by the way, is one of the most ratified conventions that the ILO has ever adopted.
Absolutely.
It is one of the worst forms of child labor, and nobody would disagree, including the children. However, they felt they had no other choice, and the children who we profiled were also going to school at the same time, so they were earning money for their school. So in terms of how a law would have affected them, frankly, no law, and this was in Cambodia, but you could find garbage dumps like this all over the world. And I have been to one like this in Bangladesh where it was almost exactly the same conditions. You could find, you could pass any law, but until there was some meaningful action on the part of the government or on the part of organizations that were working to help the children, or if there was an economic improvement that allowed those families opportunities outside the dump, as compared to the dump being a better opportunity than farming rice in the rural area, which was the case in Bangladesh. I mean, in Cambodia at the time. Then you almost always are going to hear the same argument. What other choice have you given us?
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We are looking today at Bolivia's new child labor law, the effects it has had thus far, and the state of child labor worldwide. I'm joined from La Paz, Bolivia by Sarah Shariari, a freelance journalist who has covered the new law. From Geneva, Switzerland by Simon Stain, who is a manager at the International Labor Organization who specializes in child labor. And from La Honda, California by Sarah Bachman, the co-director of founderforchange.org, which carried out a photojournalism project looking at child labor around the world. For more Global Journalist content, you can visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. And Sarah Shariari, I'd like to turn back to you. Are some of these conditions that Sarah Bachman described, where children see themselves as almost they're involved in the labor market, but they feel as though if they're not allowed to be in it, what else are they going to do? Is that the type of situation that you've seen in Bolivia, or has it been different?
Yes, I've absolutely seen and heard the same things that Sarah has. The question, if I'm not allowed to work, what am I going to do? Or if I'm not allowed to work openly and I'm forced into more and more sort of secretive underground work, it's going to be worse for me, are definitely things that you hear here. And I think the question is, what help will these children have if they're not bringing money into their families? I meet a lot of kids who come from a household where the parents or just one parent's income is really not enough to feed the family, to pay the rent, to pay the utilities. And they feel that it needs to be a collaborative effort between the entire family to meet these basic needs. And you also meet children who want to continue studying, but their parents aren't helping them with money for school supplies, so they want to earn money to be able to continue their studies. So when you talk with the kids, they'll say things like, sure, it would be great to think of a world where young people don't have to work, but that's not my world. And in my world, I have to work to help my family and to help myself. And then they'll say things like, oh, yes, the International Labor Organization, they have these ideas, but they don't understand what it's like for me personally.
Sarah Shariari, what are the types of jobs that you're seeing these children in Bolivia doing? Are they doing things that are considered by the ILO to be of the more dangerous tier of work, or are they doing more service industry type jobs?
Kids in Bolivia are doing all sorts of jobs, from jobs that are definitely amongst the worst forms of child labor, like tin or silver mining, which are done under conditions that, I mean, quite frankly, no human should be working under at all, to jobs that seem where they go out and maybe they sell at a market with their grandmother or with their mother, where they're with the family as they do those jobs, but they're definitely working in a commercial environment. So, I mean, on any given day, just here in the city of La Paz, I'll see kids cleaning windshields on the street. I'll see them selling candy on the street late at night. You'll see children shining shoes. You'll see them working in buses. I mean, there's just an incredible diversity of the type of work that children do in this country. And I think it's probably that way in many other countries.
Simon Stain, what types of strategies could countries implement if they were interested in reducing or eliminating child labor altogether?
Casey, I'll answer that immediately, but I want to say two things. First of all, just about the ILO. The ILO is not an office in Geneva. It's an organisation of 185 countries. Sarah pointed out that the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labour has been ratified by 179 of those 185 member states, almost universal ratification. We're an international agency of the United Nations, and what makes us special is that we're composed of the governments, employers' confederations and trade union organisations of the 185 member states. The actors in the world of work have set these standards, not bureaucrats sitting in Geneva. People from all over the world with real knowledge of the real economy negotiated these standards, and the governments have, as Sarah Buckman has said, found them in very ratifiable because the majority of member states have ratified them. And Sarah Shariari mentioned the point about the terrible conditions in tin and copper mining. I think my fundamental point is this: we know, and this would apply to many countries north and south, that we have occupational safety and health law that applies to adults. And we know that in many cases it isn't adequately enforced because not enough money is spent on labour inspection and there aren't enough collective agreements protecting workers. But would we argue that we should reduce occupational safety and health standards because they're difficult to enforce? I mean, it seems to me a strange argument to say because it's hard to enforce it, you shouldn't have a goal. The conventions don't expect child labour to be abolished overnight. It's a process. And some of the things you need to do to put it in place is to have the right policy mix. You need universal education. It's better if it's whole-day education rather than half-day education. You need a social protection law that protects families against the sorts of poverty that does cause them to send their children to work. You need decent work for adults so that adults can earn decent wages. Youth too. We have a massive global youth employment crisis. And there are different strategies that countries are using. In Latin America, for example, some countries are using generalised social protection benefits for families, and others are targeting them so that poor families that are in real need get a benefit on the condition that they guarantee that their child will go to school and not into child labour. So there are different strategies that are being used. But when you look at the rest of the continent, the commitment to abolishing child labour, to making sure that the skills level of societies grows, that there is a better functioning economy that is fairer and shares the wealth more fairly between rich and poor. These are the fundamental strategies that, in fact, all countries have used that have succeeded in making inroads against child labour. You need to have the political will to do it. Of course, you need to put the laws in place and you need to fund those laws. And one of the questions that I know Bolivia has been talking about is, are the interests that invest in Bolivia paying their fair share towards Bolivia's national exchequer so that it can have the social infrastructure it needs to make sure that kids are in school and not in child labour? It is about equitable distribution of wealth in and between countries and the political will of governments, employers and trade unions and others in civil society to work together to make it possible. But the fact is, everywhere else in the world, people are doing precisely that. They're not saying, let's weaken the laws because it's tough. They're saying, let's set the laws in a way that protects children and let's work damned hard to do our best to make sure they're implemented.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We are looking today at Bolivia's new child labor law, the effects it has had thus far, and the state of child labor worldwide. I'm joined from La Paz, Bolivia by Sarah Shariari, a freelance journalist who has covered the new law. From Geneva, Switzerland by Simon Stain, who is a manager at the International Labor Organization specializing in child labor. And from La Honda, California by Sarah Bachman, the co-director of photoforchange.org, which carried out a photojournalism project looking at child labor around the world. For more Global Journalist content, you can visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Sarah Bachman, to the point that Simon made about enforcement mechanisms, do you think to a certain extent it could fall upon photojournalists and other journalists who go around and document instances of child labor to rely as another means for the world to know about these types of situations and even to a certain extent lead to action as a result?
Well, it's a really interesting question. When we started this project, this is a Photo for Change is a larger project. Child labor in the global village is a part of it. So when we started Child Labor in the Global Village, we were using film cameras. There were no Twitter accounts where anybody could upload a photograph that they saw anywhere on the street. A lot has changed since then. It's possible now, and it's happening now. There are websites, there are Twitter accounts, and so on that are dedicated to on-the-street photography, photography by individuals who don't call themselves anything but bloggers. You know, they don't necessarily call themselves journalists. It's absolutely possible that anybody could take photographs of situations that they find egregious and put them on the internet or on a website that is instantly internationally accessible. That said, there are two cautions. One is that taking a photograph of any given child without making sure that the child has some protection can be harmful for that child. Number one. Number two, I've been a journalist for a long time, and I can tell you that being a witness is one, but only one ways of bringing about social change. And journalists need to do, and bloggers need to do, and ordinary people need to do the kind of witnessing that journalists do. But we are only part of the picture. Now, the ILO is part of the picture, but it's also not part of the picture. One of the things that Sarah Shariari, I hope, will address is to what extent the government has made concrete plans to follow up on its social protections aspirations, which were expressed in the bill that was passed in Bolivia. In theory, the Bolivian government is going to ensure that any children who are in the context of this law, to ensure that they have parental permission and that they have protection from some organization that is protecting children. In fact, as anybody who has walked around a slum in Dhaka or a garbage dump in Phnom Penh, or any other place in the world where you can simply walk around on the streets and see children working in jobs that are dangerous and even actively harmful. In practice, what is the government going to do? And if it's not the government, then what is other social protection measures? What other social protection measures are going to be taken?
And Sarah Shariari, we only have a couple minutes left. Would you like to respond to that? What do you think the government in Bolivia is doing about this? What is their next step, if you will?
Right. I'd like to partly respond to Sarah and also to Simon. I think when we're talking about poverty reduction and income redistribution, it's a really interesting topic in Bolivia because it's a topic that the government is heavily invested in. And Bolivia is doing things like conditional cash transfers, which is money to children who complete a school year, for example, or monies to mothers of young children. And extreme poverty is falling in Bolivia. So I think that the government is not, from what I've heard from the government, it's not that they're saying, oh, child labor, let's just let it happen and go forward with it. I think what they're saying is that we want to address the reality as it is now. Not that we want this to always be the reality, but we need to look at the way things are today. In terms of concrete plans and social protections, yes, the new law sets out specific protections, but as we know, the difference between a law and what actually happens are sometimes very different. Sometimes there's a lot of lag time. Sometimes things never come to pass. So this law is only a month old. So we're not able to really assess and see how this is happening on the ground quite yet. I think within 6 months or a year, it'll be very interesting to take a long look at what's changed on the ground.
And Simon Stain, with about 30 seconds left, what do you hope will happen next in Bolivia?
Well, I hope that the ILO's technical support to the government, the employers and the trade unions of Bolivia will help them reconsider the law. Our authoritative committee of experts will meet at the end of the year and will discuss their views and we will then look to see how we can support Bolivia's partners. I think the simple answer to Sarah Shariari's last point is and to Sarah Buckman, you're quite right. This law has reduced the minimum age in some circumstances to 10, and theoretically on the basis of individual permission. It would be much simpler to enforce a law that kept the minimum age for light work at 12 and for general work at 14 and make it clear to employers that it's unlawful to employ children in conditions less than that. The notion that children who are self-employed at 10 can somehow be assured of their safety is really, really difficult to understand. And we hope that Bolivia will accept the technical support of the ILO and will engage with us in discussion as a partner, as a constituent, and will reconsider the legislation so that it comes back into conformity with the rest of Latin America and with Bolivia's international obligations. And we wish Bolivia well in that endeavor.
Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time for this week's show. I think it's definitely a topic that we could have spent another full half hour, even an hour talking about. But that's all for this edition of Global Journalist, which is a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to our guests Sarah Shariari, Simon Stain, and Sarah Bachman. Our lead producer this week is Victoria Mitkute. Travis McMillan from RJI is our technical director, and our audio engineer is Chelsea Corrito. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Casey Morell. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.